And now we'll hear from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and Mr. Sargent.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation to appear today on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So it's no secret that Canada's economic performance has been mediocre over the last few years. Living standards have stagnated, with real income per capita growing only at 0.4% per annum between 2015 and 2023. Only a third of the growth between 2005 and 2015, which is a period that includes the financial crisis. The culprit is Canada's anemic growth in productivity, the amount of output each worker produces an hour. Indeed, productivity and growth in the business sector seems to have gone into reverse, with productivity in the second quarter of this year slightly lower than it was in the first quarter of 2019. This is in stark contrast to the United States, where productivity is now 10% above 2019 levels. It also means that Canada is now close to the bottom of the advanced country productivity league table, with productivity levels well below not just the United States, but all of the northern and western European countries, such as the UK, France, and Germany, and even slightly lower than Italy. It's no wonder that Carolyn Rogers, Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, made it clear in a speech in March that Canada faces a productivity emergency. So what should the federal government do to respond to this emergency? Well, the regulatory burden on business is a huge drag on investment and innovation. It's particularly true in the resource sector. It can now take 10 to 15 years to build a mine in Canada, but it's something that affects the whole economy. The government should be more aggressive in requiring new regulations to be less onerous than the regulations that they replace, make greater use of mutual recognition so that products approved in other jurisdictions are automatically improved in Canada, and streamline the environmental assessment process to be more efficient and less vulnerable to legal challenge. Canada's tax burden is high and has been growing. Federal tax revenues rose from 13.4% of GDP in 2015-16 to projected 15.1% in 2024-25. Cutting taxes, particularly personal income taxes, would increase incentives to work and invest, as well as encouraging our best and brightest to remain in Canada. Meanwhile, the size of government has been growing significantly. At the federal level, the number of civil servants has grown by more than 40% since 2015. And total expenditure has risen from 14.9% of GDP in 2015-16 to a projected 17.9% in 2024-25. This very significant increase in the footprint of government takes resources, both people and capital, away from the private sector. And because expenditures have grown even faster than tax revenues, Canada has gone from virtual balance in 2015-16 to a projected $40 billion deficit in 2024-25. With public debt charges of $54 billion, equal to all of GST revenues. While deficits are appropriate during a recession, when the economy is largely in balance as it is today, they make it easier for governments to avoid difficult trade-offs and push the burden of spending into the future. This means that putting Canada's fiscal house in order should be a high priority. The government needs to reduce the size of government so that taxes can be lowered and the federal budget brought back to balance. An obvious place to look for savings would be subsidies to business, which have risen massively with no appreciable effect on productivity. Another place to look is areas where the federal government is intruding into areas of provincial jurisdiction. Governments should stick to their constitutional lanes, which makes it clear who is accountable for what. Accelerating immigration, particularly of temporary foreign workers, is another important contributor to our recent productivity problems. A rapid influx of new workers means less capital per worker and therefore lower productivity. Furthermore, many of these incoming workers have lower productivity than the average Canadian worker, and that also pulls down productivity. And this is in addition to the strain that the rapid increase in immigration has put on public services such as healthcare and education, and on the housing market. It's therefore imperative to reduce levels of both permanent and especially temporary immigration and refocus the system on highly skilled permanent residents. Finally, there is one area where higher government spending is not only warranted but urgently required, and that is defence. Whoever wins the US presidential election next week will expect Canada to rapidly attain our 2% target. And I expect that the US will use the CUSMA renegotiation discussions to put pressure on us in this regard. Canada should make a virtue of necessity and have a credible plan to meet the 2% target by 2028 and ensure that the increased spending is directed towards promoting innovation in Canada's defence industry, a sector where Canada has many strengths that can be built on, which is the source of many high-paying jobs. To conclude on an optimistic note, Canada has many advantages that other advanced countries would love to have. The world desperately wants what we produce, from oil and natural gas to agricultural products to nuclear power technology to aircraft to defense material. We are also next door to and have privileged access to the world's largest economy. We should be doing so much better than we are, and we can. But it will require a federal government that is smaller, interferes less in the economy, and is more focused on delivering its core responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. MP Kelly, for the first 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Sargent, your opening statement was a damning indictment of the economic record of this government. We've just had a report of the third quarter is yet now the eighth out of nine consecutive quarters with negative per capita GDP growth. We see that per capita GDP is now lower in Canada than it was when this government took office. And the difference between American per capita GDP growth between Canada and the United States has never been worse. Can you comment on how the fiscal and regulatory policies of this government are making Canadians poorer?
Thank you for the question. So, Mr. Chair, as I said in my opening remarks, Canada's economic performance since 2015 has not been as good as the performance in the previous 10 years. The cost of the difference in income per capita amounts to around $4,000 per person had we continued on the same growth trajectory. Certainly, we had COVID during the recent period, but as I said earlier, we also had the great financial crisis in the earlier period, and COVID actually increased Canadian productivity because it had a bunch of people in relatively low productivity sectors that exited the labour market. During that period of the last 10 years, we've seen a very significant increase in government spending, in particular in subsidies to business and to others. We've seen increasing regulation, particularly in the resource sector. And, of course, we've had a very significant increase in immigration, particularly in permanent residents. And we just haven't seen any payback from those policies. Now, you could argue, well, maybe things would have been worse had we not pursued those policies. But the reality is, if we compare both to our neighbours and to our recent performance, we just haven't performed as well.
Okay, so today's or the recent report on the third quarter, which shows that per capita GDP is still declining. Is that the appropriate time to maintain the policy of the carbon tax and to proceed with increases, and also to increase the capital gains tax? We had testimony recently that the change to the capital gains tax could suppress the capital stock in Canada by $127 billion and result in a further reduction of GDP. The United States, if I understand, does not have any of these policies, and would this explain some of the discrepancy that we are seeing? And do you think that this is the time to continue to impose new taxes?
I think that the record is quite clear that we've seen very significant increase in taxes, the capital gains tax, we've had the carbon tax, and those just haven't produced the results, I think, that were hoped for. We've seen on the carbon tax that we haven't seen a very significant impact on emissions, for instance, from that tax. So I think the question now is this the right direction to go in? And indeed, if we look at the economies that are doing better, we look particularly at the United States, and particularly those parts of the United States that are growing fastest, such as the southern United States. Those are places that have lower taxes. They have lower taxes, they have smaller government, they have smarter regulation, less regulation, and they're growing faster. And so that would be a prescription that I would want to follow.
It's almost like Canada needs a government that lacks the tax and do something about the gatekeepers that are holding down the economy. Do you have some specific comments about regulation and different specific regulations? You've talked about the resource industry. How about C-69?
Well, certainly what we've seen from the Impact Assessment Act is we've seen almost no projects have gone through that system. I mean, I think there was a hope that it would streamline the system, that would make it quicker. But what we're actually seeing is of the all of the projects that are in that system now are stuck in the first two stages of the four-stage system. So we're just not seeing projects come out of that system. The time to open it, to build a mine, to move ahead on a research project, I mean, that is just getting longer and longer and longer. And the problem is in Canada, resources are the backbone of our economy. And so if we can't get these projects done, then of course our GDP per capita is going to fall.
Right. If I've got just time for another couple of questions, I'd like to shift to Mr. Robson. And we had, as I said, we had Dr. Mintz last week tell us that the carbon or the income, the capital gains tax increase is expected. He expects it to suppress capital stock by $127 billion. We also had testimony that it may result in the loss of up to 400,000 jobs. Mr. Robson, do you have your own research or modeling that would either support that conclusion, or what is your estimate of this policy change?
I think very highly of Jack Mintz, and in fact, the C.D. Howe Institute has a report from him underway right now. The direction is very clear. The magnitudes are open to debate, but there is no way that you could argue that an increase in the inclusion rate on capital gains that affects the entire corporate sector effectively, and many investors as well, is going to have any kind of positive impact. I agree with a lot of what Tim Sargent was saying just now. I think one thing that's worth highlighting is that the United States in 2017 had a very substantial tax reform that cut rates and reduced the number of distortions in their system. And anybody who doubts the importance of the corporate tax regime for investment just needs to look at what happened in the United States in the years since then and contrast it to what happened in Canada. It's clear that taxes do matter, and it's clear that the United States did something in those years that in my mind, helps to explain why the gap between us and the United States, which had been closing for many years before the middle of the last decade, has opened up since then.
Thank you, MP Kelly. Sorry. And now to
round of
MP questions, and we're starting with MP Morans for 5 minutes.
Sergeant, I'll start with you. I become increasingly concerned during my time on this committee about the economic vandalism that is being committed on this country by this Liberal government. You know, the Governor of the Bank of Canada was here on Tuesday, and they had predicted a 1.5% increase in Canada's GDP. Just today, and I asked the Governor whether or not he thought the capital gains increase would affect that, and he refused to answer me. And I can see why, because just today, Stats Canada released a report that said that the GDP growth was flat at 1%, less than the bank had actually predicted. So I can see why he didn't want to talk about that. And, you know, my colleague, Mr. Kelly, talked about the fact that our GDP has declined in the last 8 out of 9 quarters, that the United States economy grew by 2.8% in the third quarter. Let me ask you the question that the Governor of the Bank of Canada refused to answer at this committee. Do you think that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate will further damage our flat economy?
I think there's no question that that increasing the inclusion rate is going to be a disincentive to investment in Canada. And weak investment has been a problem in the Canadian economy for many years now. We need to be thinking about ways to increase the incentive for people to invest, not reduce that incentive. And that is very much the source of our weak productivity growth.
And Mr. Housen, Robson, similar question to you. What's that? Oh. The Economist magazine also says that Canada is now poorer than Alabama. Canada is now poorer than Alabama, the fourth poorest state in the U.S. Over the past 5 years, U.S. economic growth has been nearly double that of Canada's. And the Financial Post is reporting that Canada's standard of living decline is the worst in 40 years. Do you think, under the circumstances that all these different sources have described, that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate is the right thing to do at this point in time?
No, I do not think that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate is the right move. I've already spoken to the direction of its effects. The magnitudes are tough to calculate, but there's no way you can argue that it's going to do anything good. Because the luxury tax came up earlier, I'm going to mention that we've had a few tax changes in recent years that, to me, seem more motivated by maybe populist objectives than economic logic or the government's need for revenue. And I'd put the capital gains tax change into that category. I think one of the difficulties we have in Canada right now when it comes to economic confidence is that people see the tax system being used in ways that really make revenue raising a secondary consideration, and other goals more to the fore. The luxury tax is in that category. Some of the taxes on financial institutions are in that category. The capital gains inclusion rate increases in that category. So I think that Canada needs a bit of a change of direction that would give people a bit more confidence that the tax system will be broad-based, fair, lower rates, and not subject to changes with changes in the direction of the political wind, because that makes people think twice about any kind of investment.
I agree with you entirely. In fact, I read your report. And in your report, you actually describe the array of tax changes that this government has been made as capricious and populist. I wonder if you could elaborate on why you think that is the case.
Well, what taxes really ought to be for, in many people's eyes, is funding government services. And to do that, you want to find tax bases that are broadly acceptable to the population, have broad bases, and preferably quite low rates. When you have very substantial increases in government spending driven by increases in operating costs, Tim Sargent alluded to this earlier, now we're seeing interest expense mounting again. There's a lot of strain on the tax system, and it's naturally that people look ahead with some concern about how high rates are going to go. If you also have this feature of the tax system that, rather than being used simply to raise revenue in the most acceptable and economically non-distorting way, it seems to be targeted towards whoever might be unpopular at the time, then that creates a very troubling environment for people who are wondering about making a long-term investment, because the environment that they're operating in is so clearly not reliable. It's not it's volatile.
Thank you.
MP Hallen for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Sargent, Canada, as we've heard, the GDP per capita has declined 8 out of the 9 last quarters, fallen 4% since 2022. In your opinion, is Canada basically in a GDP per capita recession?
Absolutely. And normally we think of a recession as when the total national income falls, but of course what matters to individuals is not the total sum of what the income is, but what they themselves get. And that's exactly what we've seen in Canada is just declining GDP per capita. And that's outside of a major recession. That's very unusual to see.
Canada's also fallen in global ranking for tax competitiveness. This especially happened after the job-killing capital gains tax hike was introduced by the Liberal NDP government. And also at the same time, they introduced the digital services tax as well that contributed to that, and other taxes that they've been hiking up. And we know that the gap between U.S. and Canada's GDP per capita has only widened, and to quite a significant level. In your opinion, does Canada having a carbon tax and the U.S. not having a carbon tax contribute to that gap?
I think so. I mean, Canada is getting a reputation as being a very high tax country, and it's discouraging investment. It's interesting. There's a recent RBC study on this. Canada, there used to be as much money flowing out of Canada as direct investment as came in. So there's a rough balance. Yep.
The amount of time I have a lot of questions to ask you. Would you also agree that the taxes being lower in the U.S. compared to Canada contribute to that widening gap between the U.S. and Canada?
Absolutely. International capital is very mobile, and it moves around quite quickly, and Canada is uncompetitive, not just compared to the U.S., but quite a lot of other countries.
And are taxes and permitting costs being lower in the U.S. on the construction of new homes also contributing to that gap?
I mean, certainly if you're going to invest in housing in Canada, you're going to have a very long wait before you actually see anything get built, and that time is very significantly less in the United States.
Would it be fair to say that the higher taxes, as you mentioned, and longer permitting times are causing the decline in GDP per capita in Canada as well?
I think those are key contributors to the predicament that we find ourselves in.
The Prime Minister recently claimed that the increasing the capital gains taxes has what he says has no impact on whether people invest more or invest less. Does he have any idea what he's talking about?
I'm not going to speak for the Prime Minister, but I can tell you as an economist, when you increase taxation on investment and saving, you're going to get less investment and less saving.
Mr. Robson, I'll ask you the same thing. The Prime Minister claimed that increasing capital gains taxes has no impact on whether people invest more or invest less. Can you
I've already said, so I'll repeat that the direction of the impact is very clear. You're going to get less. I'm echoing Tim Sargent. You'll get less saving and less investment. The higher capital gains tax on corporations is less visible than the one on individuals, but it's pervasive. And so that is going to reduce the return on investment and make the marginal project more attractive to undertake in the United States than in Canada.
Thank you. Mr. Sargent, I wanted to, get your thoughts on the government keeps saying that it's only 0.13% of the population that's going to be affected by this capital gains tax hike. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, how it's actually not? It does affect the middle class as well?
I mean, those figures are often based on a point in time, so in a given year, how many individuals are affected. But that's very different from how many individuals will be affected over the course of the period that they hold, over the course of their lifetimes, let's say. You're not necessarily buying or selling these assets, every year. You're buying a cottage or something, and you're holding on for that for a longer period of time. So in fact, it'll actually be more people who are directly affected. And then everybody suffers if we have less saving and less investment because we're less productive as a country.
Chair, with my remaining time, I just wanted to put something on notice, if that's okay. I'll just want to put it on notice. Given that the Governor of the Bank of Canada refused to answer questions regarding the job-killing capital gains tax hike and its impact on the economy, that given it is the mandate of the Bank of Canada to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada, and given that the committee heard that this tax hike will further harm the economy, the committee called the Governor of the Bank of Canada to return to answer questions on the economic impact of the capital gains tax hike and that his testimony be included in the pre-budget consultation report.
Thank you, MP Hallen. Now we're going to MP Hallen. 5 minutes, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Sargent, I agree with everything you've said today except for one thing that I cannot agree with you on. When you said in your opening statement that it takes 10 to 15 years to get a mine built, but by the government's own admission, it takes 25 years in this country to build one, but it all ties back to the overregulation and taxes that you talked about. When Canadians are watching this, they hear from the government how rosy of a picture that they want to make it seem what Canada is like. If you were to hear Mr. Sorbera's unhinged rant or what they talk about, Canadians have never had it better. But a really damning stat came out this year that food bank usage is above 2 million people now in a single month, in the month of March, and it's doubled since 2019. Canadian standards of living is getting worse, and that's clear to see with GDP per capita decline. Can you put this into more common terms for those Canadians watching? That Tim Hortons worker working in Timmins or other people who work, what does that mean that Canadian standards of living are declining?
Quite simply, it just means there's just less income to go around. Typical families just don't have as much money to buy food or spend on rent or go on holiday or one of these kind of things that people want to do.
Mr. Robson, can I get your feedback on that as well?
Well, yes, it's very much as Tim Sargent just said. When real earnings are declining, it means that what you're getting from your work relative to the food, clothing, shelter, and other things that you want to buy, it's getting less adequate to cover it. And certainly we are, when you see year after year of that kind of decline, it pinches people. We noticed it very much because of the increases in prices, but people are now looking back to sort of pre-COVID times and realizing what a difference there is in what they're able to afford now and what they were able to afford then. So I think it's a problem in terms of material living standards, and I think it's also a problem in terms of people's optimism about the future.
To both of you, Mr. Sargent, you first, and then Mr. Robson, in spirit of this being a PBC, can you give us some testimony or input on what measures can be taken today that wouldn't cost anything that would help Canada's productivity?
I mean, I would go to regulatory reform. We often think of government in terms of spending and taxes, but regulations reach everywhere in the economy. Interprovincial trade barriers, for instance, are a huge barrier in Canada. The IMF has called that out. We talked about the regulatory system for major projects. I mean, that costs Canada investment dollars. And just around the country, there's so many businesses just complaining about red tape.
I would cite similar things. I think that reducing the size of the federal government would save money and in some cases would help to spur growth by just freeing up resources elsewhere. Regulation, a lot of the housing problems are not the federal government's remit, but it's an astonishing thing when you look at the increases, the improvements in technology of home construction over years, that the time to complete a house has actually gotten longer. And that seems to be a consequence of regulation. Interprovincial trade barriers, I would mention as well. And just to throw something out that hasn't come up yet, but I think is quite important as we think about ways of getting more investment, including from pensions funds in Canada. The Canadian government has assets that are underperforming, including airports, for example. You would not lose any money by making those available for private investment, and I think it would improve infrastructure, it would improve our supply chains, and generally give the economy a bit of a boost.
Mr. Robson, you talked about government deficits before. Can you expand a little bit further? The PBO recently said that the government is going to blow through its $40 billion budget by $7 billion. This is a trend. This is not something new for this government. Can you tell us the impact on what that has when it comes to investment?
Well, Tim Sargent alluded earlier to the fact that it can be appropriate to run deficits during recessions, but when the economy is operating at capacity, and clearly it was operating beyond capacity at times recently because we had a huge increase in inflation, though that government borrowing is going to be taking away resources that could have been used for investment. So I think that one of the problems we have in Canada, and certainly have had over a number of years now, is that for every dollar of income that we generate in the economy, we consume a certain amount as households. There's a lot that's been invested in residential construction with population growth, and we're very glad to have had that. But after you've done those two things, you don't have a lot left for non-residential investment. And if the government is borrowing money that might have been used for investment and is turning into consumption instead, then that's one of the reasons that we are getting poorer. And I will just mention, with respect to fiscal targets, I'm very old-fashioned. I think, as in the CD Howe Institute, we're not for profit. What do we aim for on the bottom line? You don't aim for a deficit. As soon as you've gone below zero, it means that people aren't taking the money as seriously. You don't have to justify an extra dollar here with what you would cut somewhere else. So I think that just that running deficits all the time really undermines budgetary discipline. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've seen such big spending increases without much for it in many cases. The CRA has increased its headcount enormously. Are they better at processing our taxes than they were? They're not.
Thank you, MP.
Thank you.
And this will be our